In today's Ranking the Ports, and by request, we are taking a look at perhaps Taito's most famous racing games. This is Chase HQ, released back in October of 1988 for the arcades, with plenty of console, portable and home computer conversions. This game likely was loved as much as the famous Outrun. Ocean dealt with the computer ports and Taito published mainly the console ports. The game's premise is very simple: race as fast as possible to catch up with the baddies who are attempting to evade you and the law, which was actually at this point in history likely better than what it is today. You will smash into them until they catch fire and eventually halt to a stop. Several levels in the game with different stages, so as always, if there isn't a port included, my sincere apologies. The Sharp X68000 will not be included, as let's face it, this would be like going head to head with the arcade original. Emulator ports such as the Sega Saturn's version will also not be included. So let's go and catch some baddies. Good God, what was Ocean thinking with this absolute abomination? Firstly, Chase HQ is a fast game. What we have here is likely one of the slowest, if not the slowest C64 racing games of all time. The sound effect sounds like something from the Atari 2600 game, and really, what is it with the colours of the track? Light green? Since when did you know a road to be light green? Interestingly, the outside of the track kind of looks like it was ripped from the Spectrum game. Now, talking about speed, you might think that because this is so slow, it would be easier to take on corners. No, it really isn't. In fact, due to the lagginess and slow frame rates, it actually makes it seem worse. And once you crash into something as you're turning, it is extremely difficult to come back out of that crash. This 1989 Ocean release was clearly not ready to release at the time. But then again, Ocean enjoyed releasing half-baked games anyway. Absolute shocking stuff. I will mention that incoming cars appeared too big, and so crashing into them was fairly commonplace for this game. Of this day and age, with C64 multi-carts and emulation, the CPU could be whacked up to make this a little better, but even then I highly doubt that. I was actually expecting the MSX 1990 conversion to be shockingly bad. I was surprised with this one. Yes, absolutely far from perfect, but a damn sight better and more playable than the C64's so-called port. With an almost monochrome gameplay area, the MSX version actually plays fairly well, believe it or not. Although it does have the Spectrum look, which you either love or hate this. It does suffer from frame drops, but having said that, it is totally playable considering that. A brown road is obviously better than a light green road, and that alone should gain this port a place higher up in this video. There is no music with the MSX version, and sound effects kind of reminded me of a cheap moped rather than a high-speed car, but that's the name of the game with 8-bit microgames. You win some, you lose some. Already from the footage you can see right now with this version, you can clearly see that Amstrad CPC conversion is by far light years ahead of other versions in more than just one way. Firstly, this port actually feels like you are racing. Secondly, this is kind of fun to play and doesn't feel dreadful whilst playing it. In Amstrad fashion, we have those high contrast colours, the layout is fairly nice, and the coder behind this also knew what colour road should be, which is a bonus. It controls fairly well, and although frame rates look a little bit choppy admittedly, it is excusable given the computer specs. It's overly a decent 8-bit micro port, which most kids at the time should have been fairly happy with. The game opens up with music, it generally has a good presentation all around, although I did note that there appears to be no sound of a siren once you catch up with the enemies in this game. If you wanted to prove that the ZX Spectrum was better than Commodore 64 back in school, this was the game to compare it with. This conversion puts the C64 port to absolute shame. For a Spectrum to be this much better is a groundbreaking achievement. Everything is here with the Spec is version. The speed perception of racing, the sounds, even the music in Sirens sounds amazing. Granted, this is running on the Spectrum 128K model, but still an absolute beast of a port considering this. Of course, in true ZX Spectrum style, it is limited to colours, but that's acceptable. Is this controllable? Yes, it is. I was using Kempston joystick and this felt very tight, if not a slight bit tricky going around corners. I think people in 1989 would have been over the moon with this version, whilst laughing at the poor C64 owners with their laughing stock of a port. My first impressions with the OG Game Boy conversion is that the angle of the game seems to be too high up, so you're kind of looking down rather than in the distance, as it were. I use all of my boosts to get me further to the enemy's vehicle, but the track just seemed endless with this port. The music is, shall we say, Nintendo music, and so it sounds a little family friendly, if that makes any sense, that is. Again, just like the next version in this video, this conversion just seemed to take everything from the source material and Nintendo-fied it, if that's a word. Is this an achievement for the original Game Boy? No, not really. It's a standard racing game and there is much better for the classic Game Boy. This version is overly boring to play and controlling your car left and right gave no depth to the game at all, just felt very bland in fact. The NES version is actually titled as Taito Chase HQ pretty much with all these console ports. This one released in 1990. I have to say that this just seemed far too easy. It felt and looked like a generic Nintendo NES 8-bit racing game and just seemed to have taken away anything that resembled the arcade game. For example, the rough roads where you crash through the barriers isn't in this version, and the music just seems to not go with this port at all. Speed perception is there, but controlling the car just felt like I was steering on ice. It wasn't too great. It didn't have that oomph whilst steering corners. In true Nintendo style, just like yesterday's Altered Beast video that I did, this version is kind of hard to judge because although it is a direct port, it is also very different to the others here. I personally think that the Sega Game Gear's 8-bit portable wiped the floor with Game Boy OG's conversion. Firstly, the viewing angle is much better with the Game Gear. Secondly, although Game Boy has monochrome, and that can help that, this game just looks much nicer in colour. It controls so much better and just feels that much more like the original version of Chase HQ. I am pretty sure that most kids of the time would have laughed at the Game Boy's version for more than one reason or another. Is it a great version on Game Gear? Of course, for Chase HQ's couple of portable versions that it received at the time, this 1991 release was very good for its time. If you didn't own a console back then, this was likely the next best thing available to play at home. Now, in comparison to the NES port of Chase HQ, the Sega Master System does a cracking job of it when compared to that version. This just seems like a much more faithful and thought of version of this 8-bit platform. Controls were squeaky clean and just seemed very enjoyable to play. Okay, so it has enabled made cutbacks to the original arcade version, such as objects and buildings on the side of the road, which is understandable. Not everything could transfer easily onto lower spec hardware. Braking and drifting around corners was very responsive, and the colours used was very acceptable given the Master System colour palette in use. When catching up with the enemy, bashing the car, it felt actually good in this version too, like it didn't seem like a chore to do either. A very nice port indeed. Sega Master System owners likely would have been happy with this version back in the day. In terms of getting more of the true arcade look, such as objects on the side of roads, such as trees and buildings and signs, the Atari ST port is very good with some nice colours used in this version too. I did find this conversion a little on the stiff side of turning right and left, and I did find myself crashing a lot with this too. We can either have sound effects or music in this version, but sadly not both. Music to me sounds much like an 8-bit sound and not much like a 16-bit computer of the time. It's pretty much 99% similar to the next version apart from the music quality. The Commodore Amiga version of the game wasn't actually that bad. I felt that the only true thing preventing some good gameplay was the controls seemed very much off. It was very difficult to handle, especially when turning corners. On average, the visuals weren't the worst, but certainly wasn't the best either. We have an option with this conversion to enable or disable music and sound effects or vice versa. The music is superb and the sound effects are pretty acceptable too. Colours used are nice, although this version did kind of reminds me of Space Harrier, oddly enough. Speed perception is definitely up there too. Hitting the enemy's cars also felt average. Like I say, nothing groundbreaking, but a fairly average, if not mediocre, Amiga arcade conversion. Next up, and in second place, I have put the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 port right just here. Because although it is a nice version and totally playable, I did find that this conversion had far too many turns to make, and the speed of the car, even when braking, was just too difficult to make most of these turns without crashing. Nice music with some great sound effects, and a really nice choice of colours used in this version. It's also, I think, one of the better PC Engine games on this platform. Without a doubt, the version is one of the most challenging on all platforms that I've covered in this video due to its increased difficulty level because of all those extra turns that the developers chose to put in this version. Everything else is fine. It is a version that is certainly worth playing if increased difficulty whilst playing a good port is your cup of tea. And in first place, the FM Towns 1990 version by Taito is a fairly faithful port of the Chase HQ original. As you can see in gameplay, it's not 100% perfected, but undeniably this version is visually stunning and it even changes the times of the day when you travel. So early examples of dynamic weather, I suppose. For example, we go from daytime and then it fades into nighttime. It is responsive to control and generally feels like a well put together game, complete with sound effects, which doesn't sound like a moped. Braking, that sounds good, and this is also featuring background music at the same time. The radio used in the game also sounds really good, much like the arcade original in fact. Speed perception is spot on. This really is a great arcade conversion and likely lesser known amongst many of the other versions in this video. This for me was a close call between the PC Engine conversion. That version didn't make first place literally because of its volume of difficult turns to make. So anyways, that's it for the Chase HQ battle with the ports, I suppose, if that's what you want to call it these days on this channel. Let me know in the comments about your memories of Chase HQ, if you had the ZX Spectrum or the C64 version. Which version would you personally rank as #1? And as always, I'm always asking for people to give me some ideas or some suggestions of which arcade port videos you want to see. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.